Hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. In this adventure, I am joined by Christopher Mastropietro. Chris works closely with John Vervaeke, and our mutual deep connection with John and his work has brought us together, as guides are often wont to do. This adventure begins rather abruptly in the recording, as our pre-recording conversation just kind of took off on its own. We jump in with a discussion related to the book Plato's Critique of Impure Reason by D.C. Schindler, which we have both found to be deeply helpful. From there, we journey to many different viewpoints on the mountain, discussing tension points we've each seen and attempting to resolve some of them. In this adventure, we often catch glimpses of the heart of the mountain itself. As always, thank you for joining, and thoughts and feedback are greatly appreciated. So when I was reading Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, and he goes into this manner of being in relationship to the good, such that your being becomes transparent, almost your narrative self, your ego self, or whatever you might want to call it, becomes transparent, and the good is able to call through you, and call to whoever is willing or wants to look. And that to me is what you were saying when you were talking about the way Schindler writes.
Yeah, that's right. The absolute service to its object. The absolute service to its object. And really it's kind of the goal of all good writing in some ways, right? It's like maybe it's just so elusive that we celebrate it when we find it, because it's hard to find, right? It's what really good poets do. They do. There's a really I remember there was a professor years ago that I whose class I attended here at the University of Toronto. His name was Nick Mout. And I remember he said, there's only one thing I remember of him, but he said something one day that I thought was quite a profound thing to say, which was that good writing, and I think he was talking about poetry, but I think it probably could be said of certainly of any kind of philosophical writing, which is that it strives for its own extinction, right? There's an object of, there's an endeavor of kenosis within it, which is to say it is trying to empty itself out even as it gives itself form. And the giving form to itself is also the giving of itself to that emptying. And when writers manage to do that, it's an act, right? And it's where speech confers itself into act. And that's why you and I were just saying before you hit record that when you're reading Schindler, you said this is a great observation you made, right? That you're on his back, and that you see as he sees, and you travel with him as he travels, that you're carried. And when writing takes on that kind of virtuosity, it changes its mode entirely. It stops being writing in some sense, right? It becomes an enactment. And I would say that at that point, it becomes symbolic in the proper sense of the term symbolic, because it becomes an active pattern. It becomes something active, right? It becomes not only representational, but it becomes something that participates in the very thing to which it refers, right? So the sort of the Paul-Tillich definition of symbol.
Yeah.
And it's the most elusive thing to try and do. And I think in some ways, if you set out to do it, you don't. You do it not because you've set out to do it. You do it because you've disposed certain relationship to the object of your speech, that you participate in its content. And it's by virtue of participating in its content that its content renders itself in care of your language. Right? And that's what I think Schindler's doing in some sense, which means that being able to convey and to carry its meaning in a symbolic manner cannot be differentiated or separated from the proper apprehension of its content. which kind of brings us back to a bit of contact epistemology, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, what I was just going to say is I had this thought the other night that if perception is upstream of action, what's important is if you're ever trying to modify, say, a behavior or a pattern in your life that you're acting out, it's not really very powerful to try to engage at the level of the action. What's much more powerful is to engage at the level of the perceptual landscape. And it strikes me that the manner in which the author can render in his writing a glimpse of the thing in itself, should the reader be willing to follow with him, maybe, is afforded by his willingness to open his perception and like will toward the good as best he can with his perception. And thus the actions that happen downstream become a sort of kenosis, but it starts with this sort of kenosis of the self in the perceptual way of engaging with reality.
And yet everything you just described sounds like action to me, right? The nature of the perception that it reminds me a lot of the way you just spoke about that is very much the way Guy talks about listening. Remember when I first started talking to Guy, he has this idea about, it's like he completely changed the way I think about listening, as a proper adherence of the organ to its object, right? As the empty oneself in service of being filled with the encounter that's presented to you. And then it's not action in any traditional sense of the way we think about action, but I can't think of anything more active than that.
Yeah.
So if it's upstream of action, it's only upstream when we break it apart semantically or conceptually. But I think that in the embodied felt quality or phenomenology of it, I actually am not sure it's upstream at all. I think it's actually somehow shares its identity. That perception shares its identity with action. Right? Think of the old Augustinian idea, which is really more of a Platonic idea that completely reverses the idea that we're passive receptacles for sense input, right? That no, it's the soul casts its gaze out and retrieves the world, right? That the perception is a kind of act, an act unto the good, right? When it's oriented properly. Yeah. And so it's so interesting that we can sequence that. And I think that there's value and there's a lot of legitimacy in sequencing perception and action in the way that you've just done. But then we can just as easily telescope them back together.
Yeah. You know what that makes me think of is that, you know, when Socrates presents the cave, it's done in this dramatic sense first, but then after it's presented articulately, it's reversed onto itself to hearken to the fact that while it seems as if you need to go up when you're at the bottom, in fact, there's this strange way in which you're already at all the other levels. It's just you don't know it yet.
Yes.
It's this entrapment of attention because there's no, like, if attention has to go both ways at once. Like, this is one of the things that blew my mind when I learned from John, right? That it's like attention doesn't just intake what is attended to. It's in some sense transfers the self into that thing.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Yes, exactly. Because it organizes the conditions of what we perceive before we've perceived them, insofar as that can be expressed sequentially, right? We're once again back into that trap of thinking about things in a temporal sequence, which is why it's funny you say that. You just reminded me of there was a chat recently. I'm not sure if you've seen it. You may have, between John and Peterson and Jonathan Pajot. And they've had a few conversations where, and I think John had one very similar with Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan as well, in the last maybe year or so, which was a lot of fussing around with narrative and the primacy of narrative. And it's very important to John that narrative not have ontological primacy. And I find that interesting, and I find that these discussions about the primacy of narrative or lack thereof have been very interesting.
Yeah.
And in this conversation, I'm thinking of Peterson was much more interested in the primacy of narrative, and was challenging John at that point, and John was challenging him back, and it was an interesting little dialectic. But I think what it makes me think is that narrative is simply a particular, it's almost like it's a particular aspectualization of the way in which a pattern is actually contained in its nature, right?
Yes.
And that if we fan that nature out and aspectualize it in such a way, in accordance with a certain symbolic grammar, that symbolic grammar renders it into a certain kind of temporal sequence, or something that we perceive in a temporal sequence anyway. Does that mean that the narrative formulation is primary? Well, maybe not, but it is one way of representing horizontally something that is not necessarily horizontal. And when you were making that, because when you said that about the cave myth, that's exactly what it makes me think, which is that the cave myth is a way of in an accordion fashion, showing that when you articulate the sort of the symbolic pattern out and give it a certain form, you can render it in such a way that it passes that arc. That doesn't mean that that's the only way to express it. It just means perhaps it's the most accessible way, or the most lucid way to express it. And that's why myth and narrative give us access to so many things that don't need that form to exist in themselves.
Yeah.
We seem to need that form in order to access them, which means that the primacy of narrative is an interesting question, right? It's like, what do we mean by that in the first place?
So if I may play with that, yes. I'm fully on board with this, and I really appreciate that articulation, because one of the things, okay, so now we can get to one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about in this conversation is what my project is, I suppose. Maybe it's not my project, it's the project of this existence, maybe, has seemed to become an attempt to understand where this Christian narrative, how far it goes, and to see how much I can existentialize it with integration from the kind of space that, like, John's work points from and to. So a sense of deep connectedness to the best ability to understand what it means to be a person from the side of being a person, you might say, right? Because if you're starting from science, you're starting from the side of being an individual person with these sense-making capabilities. And that's the opposite side, in some sense, from which, say, the Christian narrative at least claims to come. It claims to come from the other side, beyond being in some way. And so what I keep finding as, say, I'm building from the side of science toward the side of the spiritual, because I started with this spiritual thing, but it didn't seem to connect. There was no connection between the two. And then now that I've started building out from the scientific side, this spiritual side seems to, every time I turn around and look at this a little bit more closely, there's also this spiritual dimension where it's, well, that actually maps the whole time. So part of that has been, recently, having watched the conversations you're referring to, has been trying to make sense of how the narrative maps on to, say, our narrative, because there's these historical differences what we understand about history, maybe, and also this primacy of narrative issue, as if the temporal time frame of history is somehow the base frame in which knowledge is collected, or something like that. But what I thought about when you were talking about that, sorry, I got a little bit of a tangent there, but what I thought about when you were talking about that was, if narrative has this kind of horizontal aspect to it, but it lacks the vertical, maybe there's a way in which the ultimate story would be the one that was horizontal, so it can reach you at whatever level of the cave you're in, but it correspondingly can move up every level of the vertical. So if you move from, the world of pure images to the world of pure ideas, the narrative actually works at every level. It's just because you can see through the level below it, you can see through the narrative to the beyond that it points to.
Yeah, well said. In some ways, I think that what you just described is exactly the function of, it's really the function of the myth in the first place. It's really, and it's the function of the parable, arguably. And maybe also the function of the koan. Those, because myths have a structure, have a temporal structure that exists outside time, right? Which is interesting if you think about it, right? Like, how do you? It seems to track a temporal structure, but it's not time bound, right? All it is the articulation of a pattern. Often the pattern is cyclical and recurrent as well, right? Even the cave, even the myth, even the cave is, right? Also, it literally uses, there's a representation of a vertical ascent within the horizontal structure, and then there's a return to the cave, right? So not only do you have the illustration of a vertical descent, but you also have a recurrence that's built into the myth itself. And so you're using, like what poetry does, is you're using a form that is inherently finite to contain the infinite. That's what makes it symbolic, right? When the part can somehow presence the whole without being identical with it, then it becomes, I think, properly symbolic by definition. And so then the structure of the myth, or the structure of the parable maybe is a little bit different. Let's just stick with the myth for a second, just so I can be clear in my mind. The myth effectively does that, right? I think. Somehow manages to straddle the temporal and whatever is outside of it at the same time, which is why it's so translatable, which is why it can be, in a sense, transliterated so well, right? Which is why it lends itself to different kinds of media depictions, right? You can illustrate it, right? You can illustrate myth in such a way that, I mean, a lot of Jonathan's work is showing exactly that, right? How a single image can nest patterns, and an image does not have a temporal structure, right? And yet that same nest of patterns, when put on a different axis, when aspectualized in a different way, when sequenced in a different way, might be create a different rendering, but is exactly the same pattern, just in a different form. So it's funny. So when I think of myth in that sense, I don't think of story necessarily. I think of story as being one. I'm searching for the right term. Let's say one form, and that what really we mean by the myth, isn't its narrative depiction. We're ultimately making reference to and trying to invoke whatever it is that's nested, that undergirds its structure. And that structure is not a temporal structure. It's not a horizontal structure. It's just being depicted horizontally, right? Anyway, I think that you've said all of that already, but I think that's what you're getting at. Please correct me if it's not.
Yeah.
And understanding that, if we take that as a premise, then the entire way of understanding history becomes very interesting, right? Very, very, very interesting.
Yeah, when
And
the timeline becomes
memory,
when the
and
timeline becomes flat.
yeah, right, exactly, and then all of a sudden, the literalism with which we understand history, and it's just like, talking about all the things we talk about, and understanding the things in the way that we're understanding them, to then look back at history and to look at history literally, I find impossible after this. It doesn't make it any less interesting as a discipline of study. It just means that the way it is important to me changes, right? And then questions of the intersection between religion and history then become open to a completely new form of perception.
Yes.
Right? Then what then does the historical Jesus actually mean, if we understand the temporal articulation of history as one form of a pattern that is being reconstructed by our collective memory? Right? Doesn't mean it's not real. It just means, like, what kind of real is it? Right? Because the way in which a symbol is real is not the way in which we're accustomed to thinking of things as real, because we're so trapped in our materialism. And I find that very challenging. Like, none of this comes easily necessarily to think about. We have to do a lot of there's a lot of contortion that has to happen in order for this to even become available, I think, to the imagination. But once it starts becoming available, then boy, everything starts to change. And I'm hearing some of that in what you're saying. Hopefully I'm not interpolating it too much.
No, yeah, I'm like, there's so many places I want to jump off with that. Because yes, like, that's all I can say is yes. There's this way in which, okay, what I want to talk about is, there's a lot of beautiful things later on that I wanted to jump on, but I want to talk about the more existential thing that I saw as you were going along there, was this manner in which the ability to see the symbol, the ability to participate in the symbol, is in some sense the same kind of thing that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, in the ability to, or the willingness to, open oneself in order to jump on the back of the writer and watch where they want to show you. It's that epistemologic humility to make that choice, the freedom of the will, maybe you might say, and to make that choice in relationship to, say, reality itself. I'll tie this back in with where you finished, I think, in that idea, was this pattern of Christ, this pattern of that, or maybe the way in which Jesus was the last Adam, and the way in which the body of a human being that was fully like me somehow was that in touch with God, was something like that manner of participating in the full extent of his reality at all times. And that gave such a depth of conformity and contact with reality that there actually was no difference between what it meant to be man and what it meant to be God.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. And that, I think, is what that sameness of identity, that I am he and he is me, is something that is the purest expression of the symbol, right? And that's also somehow key to this entire enterprise, right? The ingress, the way in, seems to me to have something to do with that in its absolute simplicity. And that encounter, the encounter that provokes that co-identification, that insight, that's not a cerebral insight, it's an embodied, felt, phenomenological reality that occurs to you paradoxically, in spite of all that is and all that you are, and also because of all that is, because of all that you are, that incurs on you, often in spite of yourself, and in defiance of every material constraint and condition that you live and know, and also because of all of them, right? That one of the reasons I love Kierkegaard so much is that he understands that we have to somehow be sensitized to the possibility of living within the tension of paradox in order to be sensitized for that encounter. And then if we're not prepared for it properly, we will deny it and refuse it. We'll decline it. We'll take offense to it, to use his words, right? Because it's absurd, because there is a way in which it is absurd, right? It defies the outer and upper limits of our capacity to intellect it and to represent it to ourselves. And right, that's why the symbol is usually converted into the idol when we try, because the symbol is something, it seems to me it's something like this, that the symbol is the part presencing the whole, and the idol is the part mistaking itself for the whole. Right?
Yes.
And
let's pause right there, because we're going to lose this recording because I logged in with the wrong account. I'm very, very sorry.
Oh, all right.
Okay, I apologize. My goodness. This is.
I was prattling on too much anyway. Zoom was like a karmic correction.
Well, that's a kind of a cosmic joke. If that is prattling on, that's a wonderful paradoxical joke indeed.
That's actually that's a great instance of like a Kierkegaardian moment of humor too, which is like you contrast the ostension to loftiness and infinitizing yourself and dwelling in this, and then something abrupt and completely
trivial.
That's right. It undermines all of it in a moment. It's great.
Yeah. There's the notion of the cosmic giggle is so important, because while you were channeling that notion, that connectedness sense, you can get so, and this has been my problem, is I can get into that space where you feel that, and then the danger is when the joke happens and you're suddenly back in the cave, and it can become so much worse because of where you've seen you could be.
Yeah.
And that that is maybe at least from my perspective so far, the most imminent and tangible danger associated with a real journey to really commit yourself to being human.
Yeah.
Because what I wanted to say in response to you talking about the symbol is that in some sense, the ultimate symbol that we all know is just to be human, because in a real sense, that's all we actually do know.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, there's a reason that we understand humans as being made in the image of God, because whatever God is, that doesn't mean God looks like a human, but it means that the only way we can become connected to the fullness of everything that is by becoming fully what we are.
Yeah.
And so that like the ability to fully indwell the symbolic connectedness to being simultaneously requires the indwelling of it in you, and thus it, like, the whole thing, it's like a zipper coming together, right? It's like it's finally whole.
Right. Yeah, that's right. There's no transcendence in the care of a symbol without you cannot leave out the finite end of the dichotomy. It's like it's through the finite end of the dichotomy that the symbol is actually fleshed, made manifest, made real, which is why that love, I think, that agapic love, so defined, is a love toward and through the most destitute of the finite, right? It's why we love for the wretchedness. It's why we love for what's most indigent. It's why we love what's most lowly, what's most base. That is the object of the agapic love, because it is that realizing force that makes absolute what's conditional and knows it absolutely, right? No, I love what you said. I think it's, yeah, beautiful, and it's why it accounts, I think, in part, God knows, not exhaustively, but in part accounts for the particular excellence, the philosophical excellence of the Christian symbol, because somehow it collapses the identity, as you say, between that which is most transcendent and the absolute indigence of man in his basest, in his most animal, in his greatest suffering. And the paradox that it is through the suffering that the suffering is relieved is it is such a thwarting idea in the with a capital I, you know, that I mean, the whole point of it is that we can't, there's no amount of ratiocination that gets us around it, right? We must be related to it for it to be known. And I think that's what, and that's, I think that's where faith, I think, in its proper meaning begins, is that as an expression of relatedness to the absurdity of that paradox. And there's no way to be related to that paradox except in the care of a relationship to man, which is also the relationship to oneself, right? I am he, he is me. And to me, it seems that suffering is somehow the way into that relationship, which is why the moving image of the entire tradition is the moving image of suffering. Because there's something about suffering, and it's difficult to talk about it in this way, because I think for a lot of people, and I think for me too, at one point in time, it seemed, I mean, it's easy to see it from a kind of Nietzschean perspective, right? And that perspective is very helpful. Like, dialectically, it's really important to have that perspective, because then that's a really, really formidable. I'm just sort of throwing that out there, assuming that you're tracking this, but if not, I can go into it.
No,
but I feel like
yes.
But that's a very, very formidable perspective, and it's one that has to be dealt with, and it has to be accounted for, and it has to be addressed. But I think that one way of addressing that is that is that it's not a kind of compensatory asceticism. I've never seen it, though. That's not true. I've never seen it that way. I don't see it that way now, or I'm trying not to see it that way. That it has something to do with, it's a much more shamanic. I think understanding it shamanically, I find very helpful, right? As a strategy, as that only in a certain form of deprivation and darkness can the relationship between the dark and the light actually reverse. And it to me, it seems to have something to do with that. That it's through not just physical suffering, also existential, perhaps more so existential, but they're all aspects are represented in that one symbol, right? That symbol's not just a depiction of physical suffering. It's a depiction of the anguish of existence itself, right?
I mean, I think you've laid out quite well where I think Jesus's last words on the cross that I've talked about.
Yeah, and your conversation with John about this, I thought was really wonderful. And I know something you talked about. Yes,
this is very much the kind of thing that I don't know how to talk about, but the way it presents itself to me is that so one of the ways that I would talk about it, I use the symbol of Mount Sophia. That for me is typifies Mount Sophia and the Tower of Babel, typify this, it's the yin and the yang, it's whatever thing you want to put there. But the being aliveness of what it means to be human, maybe, and the building of the death of what it means to be human. What I mean by that, and what I'm referring to when I say what it means to be human, I think that means to be in contact with reality. I think that's what it means to be human. And that the Tower of Babel is what we build in all of our map making, in our patterning of patterns, when we are not in proper ratio religio with reality itself. But you can still build a mountain.
Oh yeah.
And you can, and that's, I think, what it means to be Nietzsche, right? Is that you're standing on the mountain, like you're there, you're up there. But because it's built on this fundamental move of holding a piece of the self back and using that as the ground to look, that it is the Tower of Babel instead of Mount Sophia.
Because the mountain always stays in part concealed from you, right? That's why, I mean, if I had to be sort of cruelly reductive about everything you've just said, it's like the Tower of Babel is ultimately the representation of the idol, and Mount Sophia is the representation of the symbol. Because the symbol always remains concealed. It always remains half concealed by definition, and so does the mountain. And also, the idol is something that we fabricate. The symbol is something that I think of the term that I know John likes and that we use periodically, inventio, which is the simultaneous creation and discovery. Right, creating such, right? That's the Michelangelo with the marble. It's the famous Plotinus analogy to the sculptor of the marble, right? It's like, I'm not creating this. I'm actually revealing it.
Yes.
Well, of course, that's poiesis. In its proper term, poiesis is the simultaneous revelation and creation. It is creating that which is already. It harkens to the anamnesis, the recollection of the Platonic tradition, which is, I am creating anew that which was. And I love the existential tradition when it's oriented properly. In other words, when it's Christian, which because I mean, after that, I don't know what the heck it's doing after that. But But
Well, it's
but
gotten perverted
but the whole
because
that's
it's gotten perverted because somebody grabbed most of the Christian thing and did, hey, I want this part for myself, and then one more and one more and one more, and then suddenly they've built a whole Tower of Babel from the place of being existential, but they didn't build it on agape.
Exactly. And there we go again, a part mistaking itself for the whole. Right. And the atheist existentialists, I think, basically did that. To be very general about it, maybe here and there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that this idea of having to strive to become what you are already is that's right at the bottom of the Christian existential tradition, right? And with all due paradox implied, right? Yeah. And so so I love this idea that Mount Sophia is infinitely discoverable, infinitely knowable, infinitely re-aspectualized from every because the sum of all vantages and perspectives are still not comprehensive, right, of it. And so now here's a question for you, because one of the things I find, I can't think of and you've named your channel Mount Sophia, right?
Climbing on Mount Sophia, yes.
Climbing on Mount Sophia, which is a great name. I can't think of Mount Sophia for obvious reasons without thinking of a very feminine countenance. And I think that there are many, many deep reasons for that. But I suspect that this is something that you've probably thought about too. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. What your relationship with that nature of Mount Sophia is, or of Sophia herself, and how that all plays into this for you.
Yes, thank you. So I really appreciate that, first of all, that you would say that. Thank you. It's been a strange thing, as a side note, I don't know why I named it that exactly. When I started my channel, I started it so that I would not have to just upload video calls I was having with interesting people to Google Drive to share with my brother and my brother-in-law and my father, who I discuss with a lot. And for some reason, I didn't want it to be just my name. And I thought, it just kind of came to me. And so I named it that. And then since then, oddly enough, all the conversations that I've been having, it's become actually the central symbol of this channel for me and what it means to have these conversations. And in a sense, where I feel myself to go in these conversations, and it actually, there's this strange way in which it lays itself out as a visual landscape when I'm in and I don't like to label ever being in a place for sure, because I don't know if I'm actually in the place that someone's talked about, because it usually gets deeper as I go further into it. But what I think is, what I feel when I hear John talk about the Dialogos space, that to me is what that feels like when it's as if this sense of, it's like what we were talking about with reading DC Schindler and watching from his back. It's as if you almost come into this thing where you can see these notions and these ideas and these landscapes like lay themselves out for you in the conversation. You just look around. And I think I like talking about that inventio in that way, because like one of the things that hit me really hard at one point, and I don't know where I got this idea, but that we never create anything. We just move things around, because no human beings ever created anything in their life. It's just, you can move things around and you can change them into different shapes, and you can, combine them, you can smash them together, you can pull them apart, and apparently even, like atoms we can tear apart, and we can tear apart everything and we can put it together in a lot of really interesting ways, and it's cool. Like we can do some amazing things, but like you're still just moving things around. And so if you know how to properly position yourself in relation to the thing that you're moving around, whether it's a block of wood that you're trying to build into a table, or whether it's your partner who is having some kind of maybe say significant life crisis, and you're trying to be there in the space with the person. It's, if I am relating to this properly, it and indwelling it properly, like being with it properly. And that's what I think this agapic thing like really means to do in an existential sense. It means to take the awareness of what it means for me to be in this space and come into the space with the person. Like I do medicine, and this is what I try to do, and it's very difficult to do on a consistent basis, but what I try to presence and engage when I go in and talk to a patient, especially a patient who is facing the end of their life. One of my I think I discovered myself to be in medicine at some point along the line because of an ability or a connectedness to the meaning that is experienced when people are at the end of their lives, and to engage in that space with people. And so now one of the most, by far the most rewarding aspect of my job is to be with someone and presence to them their own mortality, and but hold them in that space in such a way that they can be with it and come to grips with something that most of us in the modern world attempt to spend all our lives denying, and that we are ultimately not here forever, and that everyone dies. And it's one thing to know that everyone agrees with that. That's one of the lines I lead with because I try to orient people toward this thing, but everyone agrees with it, but very few have really presenced what that means for them. And so when someone learns that their life is really coming to an end, and they come face to face with that in the existential moment, that's kind of a fundamental, for Tillich, the fundamental anxiety, one of the fundamental anxieties of being is really there existentialized in your face. And I find that to the degree that I'm able to, because I don't do it, I've learned that if I try to do the agapic thing, it's like I have to stand on my own ground. So I can't do the agapic thing. I can only get out of the way and allow it to come in. But to the extent that I can do that, or it can do that through me, there's a thing that happens with people that is real. It's like, it's almost this divine connection that I've seen in some of the people that I've had that conversation with, where it's like they can be in that space with that existential thing, and they can like really look at it and have the courage. Like you can almost like help, like give courage to the person to be with the thing, because you're there and willing to be with the thing without any kind of pretense about, whatever hangups I have about my own personal life, or, our politics, or, what I had for breakfast that morning that's not agreeing with me. Like if all those kinds of things are gone and I'm there and I'm like feeling how it feels to look at death in the face, then it's like they're able to be there and we're able to be there together, and it's somehow more okay.
Okay. Do you remember the first time that you did that with a patient?
I don't think so, because it's been a progress of learning how to not do it. And so it's not as if there was a moment, as if there was one engagement where that happened or didn't. it's more as if there is a degree to which I'm able to be out of the way. Because like I said, when it's me trying to do it, it
Right.
it's different. So
Okay.
yeah.
So okay. So then it's like the formulation of the question is wrong. It's more like, by the sounds of it, it's like you found yourself in it, and then tried to let it be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. How this is very interesting. I do that's a part of the practice of medicine that I have no idea, because I've never interacted with it directly from any vantage. I have no idea how common or uncommon. I imagine it's uncommon, but I don't know, that practice is between a physician and a patient when the patient is nearing the end of life. And I would imagine that the wherewithal and the courage and the strength of presence it would take to hold that space with a patient and to not shirk from it yourself is the kind of constitution that probably not a lot of people, not to say nothing of physicians, people, anybody has to hold that with somebody. How much in your experience is that actually something that are you an outlier? Are you a real rarity, as I suspect you are? Or is this something that, for doctors that often find themselves in this position, is this something that a lot of people in your position have to undertake?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. So thank you, first of all. I mean, I'm cautious to talk about it because it's such a vast field, and I don't want to either maybe minimize the efforts of very good physicians to do that on one hand, or to minimize the gravity of what I'm trying to talk about here on the other. And I'm not sure how to do that in a general way. I can't
Sure.
speak about the field in general and not do that.
Fair enough.
But in my experience, in my personal experience in training, I was fortunate to have a few physicians who they wouldn't use this kind of language, and they wouldn't have it be they would not talk about it nearly as spiritually or as philosophically, or as symbolically, maybe, as I was trying to there. But they did participate in that conversation in such a way as they were doing the same thing. I don't know if they would articulate that was what they were doing, and I don't think they would connect it to this notion of agape. It's like, but I do think, and there are some really, maybe more lately, there's been some really good efforts to cultivate this space in the practitioner community. So and there's been some really good books. One of them, there's a book called When Breath Becomes Air that was written by a guy who was a neurosurgeon, and he was just finishing his last year he was nearly finished with his fellowship, which to be finished with your fellowship as a neurosurgeon is, you're in your late 30s, early 40s sometimes. And he was diagnosed with lung cancer, and I think it was lung cancer, and he died maybe a year later or so. And he was incredibly articulate. He had maybe a master's in literature from Oxford or something. And it's a beautiful book that wrestles with the difficulty of death, but from the perspective of a physician. And so that was one that, for me at least, as being inside the medical community already, was really, really helpful because in order to presence this thing that I'm talking about in this way, you have to have looked at your own mortality already.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, sorry, I'm gone on a tangent here a little bit, but yes, I do think that there are a lot of people in the medical community who have a hard time being in that space, and not for any weakness of character, but they just don't know how to do it. And because they're not equipped to understand what it means to be in that space with someone, or what it means to die in an existential kind of way, they can't be in that space. And so it's a quick conversation. It's kind of slid in there on the side, or it's like, things don't look good, where in reality, like, or we're going to keep trying. Let's try this thing. Let's try that thing. And not that taking, and I don't want to say that taking Hail Marys shouldn't be done, because some patients really want that. And it should be based on what the patient, where they're at, what decision they want to make. Do you want to continue reaching for everything? Because that's one of the strange things about medicine, is there's a lot to reach for to continue your life. But the question is, on what basis and at what quality? And so there's, having the willingness and ability to presence that to the patient and offer them at least the option of, do you want to continue the Hail Marys, or do you want to be comfortable and allow your life to end, as it most certainly will anyway? Just presenting the question it's a difficult thing, but it's an important one.
Well, that's so interesting, because it seems to me that the presentation of the question is everything. How that question is framed. It's like, in many ways, it's like there could be no more final or fundamental question, right? It's like it's a to be or not to be question in some sense, and how you frame that question. How you frame that question will determine its meaning, and will determine the meaning of the entire dilemma, right? Just the formulation. Just the formulation. And it seems to me, from everything you're saying, that if that's the only thing that you do right, that's enough. Mm-hmm. How to ask a question like that, because that means knowing what the question actually is, which is not a given, right?
Yeah.
The right question is the single most valuable and elusive thing that you can find in any given situation. It's the thing, it's the key, it's the thing that opens access to yourself and to everything that is relevant.
Yes.
And that seems to me to be such a situation in which finding the right question is actually also just finding the right way. They're the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting.
And I was very fortunate to get to train with a particular physician who did that so well. He was kind of the heart and soul in some ways of the institution where I now work. He was an older gentleman who's now retired, but you're able to find and frame and be in that space with the person to the degree that you are, because it's a love thing, right? That's real love. And so that love is something that you can't manufacture. It speaks to the quality of the individual themselves. And so, this particular physician, when he walked through the halls of the hospital, He knows the names of the grandchildren of the people who clean the bathrooms. Like, literally. I mean, we would be walking down the halls and he would stop and, oh, hey, George, how's so-and-so doing? And, he's a janitor. He cleans the bathrooms. Most doctors don't talk to the janitor staff. And, so as with everything else that I have stumbled into in my life that's good, it was bequeathed to me by someone who had been there before. So I'm very grateful for that.
Such is always the case. It's always the case in my experience. We get it from somewhere, from someone. The best that can be said is that we pay attention to the right people. And if that's all we do right, then maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough, right? So interesting what you say about that holding that space for a patient is really just holding it for yourself. And in some sense, they're really just the same thing, aren't they? That if you can't ask yourself that question, you really can't ask them. And if you can't look it full in the face, then you can't look them full in the face, because they are that question reflected back at you, right? It's like talking to them is talking to you. There's the symbolic co-identification, by the way.
Yep.
There's the love.
Yes.
The love of the symbolic conjoining of identities as I am you, you are me. And we both live in the tension of this question. And my love for you is love for the sum of the mystery of that tension itself. Right. And that's the kind of thing that can only be realized in virtue of adopting someone else's attention who sees it before you do. And just like you described on the back of DC Schindler, as you read the book, you look where they look, see what they see, and you comport yourself to match. And then you see it yourself. And then others will see you seeing it. And they'll see it too. And that's the best that can be said.
And thus Socrates becomes transparent.
Yeah.
Yep. That's tough to say anything after that.
It is, isn't it? Well, maybe we don't have to. It's fascinating, Ken. It's like all of this that we do, that we talk through, is really all for naught if it can't come to bear in a moment like the one you're describing. Philosophy is a preparation for death. It's like, there we go, right? That's what it has always been, or properly what it's always been. And if it can't be that, it can't be anything worthwhile.
Why Socrates chooses to die rather than divorce himself from the reality he has known.
That's right. Because, and I think about your conversation with John, your discussion of sin, which I found very interesting. And that sin, in some sense, is mistaking the orders of reality. It's mistaking something ultimate that isn't. It's beholding yourself and committing yourself to an order of what's real that is not sufficiently real, right? That's not the whole, but thinking it is, being determined to make it so. And so even though this term was not voguish in the Platonic tradition, it's Socrates turning away from sin, right?
Which in some sense is the symbolic representation of the individual intellect, because it is the turn from sin fundamentally, because sin is not an action in the sense of, like, this is what sin really is it's so far upstream of what we think of as action in the world. A sin is usually identified with, stealing something, right? And it's like, that's an action in the physical world. And so far upstream of that was the decision to fundamentally, I think, as far as I can tell, a decision to arbitrarily change the prioritization of relevance realization. And the cascading effects downward from that. And that is what ultimately will end up in the action of, say, stealing. And the degree to which that arbitrary reprioritization happens, that's a word, is the degree to which hell will be actualized in the individual that is participating in the sin. Because the thing that is, the thing that most haunts the destitute vagabond that has no connection left is that he once knew what it meant to be connected.
And he can't retrieve it. It's like what you're describing, I think, is something like the hermeneutics of the relationship that you have with being, right? The way in which the signs are interpreted. It's like it's a semiotic problem in some sense, right? It's like, it's interesting when you see two people in a relationship where the hermeneutics of the way that they apprehend one another are so misaligned with the reality of what is being conveyed that every premise of every moment is wrong. And it's very difficult when you see that in action, or when you find yourself living it in action, which is the really horrifying experience, right? Of realizing that you simply misread every sign that you see. You mistake it for pointing in a direction that it's not pointing, right? And so every turn you make is a wrong turn, because the entire hermeneutic structure that conditions the way that you apprehend the presentation of the world is somehow off its axis. And I think this is what you mean by it's just like a fundamental disorientation. And that's why I think it has to, and thinking of it, this is where it goes to Dialogos, and I think what it's doing, and I think what we're trying to do with it, and it's all still a little mysterious, but I think that the aim of it fundamentally is about using the symbolic presence of the relationship between beings to retrain a relationship with being. And that the human to human relationship is the symbolic container for how we cast out and retrieve the semiotics of the way that the world becomes legible to us, and what we do with it, right? And if we can help teach each other to reread the signs, to change the semiosis and realign it, turn it transparent, to use your beautiful phrase, then we're on the right project. If we can do that, right? It's become so hard to know what kind of relationship we're in until we're tilted off of it. I kind of think this is sort of what's going on, like, to connect it back to sin. It's like, it's kind of what's going on in Dante, right? Like every contrapasso, like the representation of the reprisal, the divine reprisal for each sin, is basically a recreation of the it's a symbolic rendering of the nature of the relationship that person had with being.
Yes. If you're really good at putting a metaphor on how it feels to be in an emotional state, you get basically Dante's
Right.
structure.
That's right. That's right. My favorite one is the incontinence one, which is just people being blown about by a gale, right? And it's like, boy, anyone who's ever felt that, you know what I mean? It's just
Yes.
yeah, that's what that is.
Yep.
And it's and that's why the symbolic rendering is somehow more real than a description of the actions.
Yes.
To your point, a descriptions of the actions that are downstream from the incontinent relationship that is caught up in the gale are instantiations of that sin, but they are not the sin. The sin is the relationship itself, the formal structure of the hermeneutics of that relationship that are then enacted and recreated by that gale, that wind, right? That is what is upstream.
And this is why the law is fulfilled in Christ. Because the law is about actions. The law is about the active participation in reality as a concrete individual. But to move to, say, the kingdom of heaven or humanity 2.0 or whatever you want to call it, to move into that space requires such a level of connectedness to reality. It inherent in it is the absence of sin itself. And thus, it's not that the law becomes, nullified. It's that the law becomes fulfilled. It's full. The expanse of the law that could be written, which is infinite, because the space of relationship to reality is infinite.
Right.
And
so that the law in that moment, the law becomes the law adheres itself to the logos.
Yes, and I think and why I'm stopping there is I don't know how to say it, but there's this way in which that's what it means for Christ's death and resurrection to pay for the sins of the world. It's because the resonance becomes strong enough at an individual point in the narrative structure of reality that we're all in. That resonance is so clear, it's so pure, and it's so that the whole thing actually becomes real, regardless of the degree to which we have made ourselves non-real.
Right. Right. Every scale collapses back together. Everything telescopes in again. And the participation of every part to the whole is somehow consummated.
Yeah. And this is why, like when and this is the kind of place that I want to get to with John, because I'm like, this is why I'm not sure about I understand, and probably I don't really understand fully, but to the degree that he's talked about his hesitancy with the idea of Christ as God. And I understand that. And it's a tension that I allow to be there. But for me, it just looks more beautiful if I allow for the other to be the case somehow.
What do you mean the other? If you allow for the other to be the case?
That Jesus was the actual incarnation of God himself. Like somehow that just hits a little bit more clearly or something. I'm not sure how to say, but maybe, yeah, anyway.
Yeah. Well, I hear you. I hear you. I hear you. And I think I don't want to speak on his behalf, but I think
and don't feel like you need to. You're
no, I don't. But I think
I'm not trying to paint him into a corner here. It's just that's the note of, that's kind of the core of maybe the struggle, you might say, of, and it's not a struggle, but just where I'm at in this. John's work has taken me far beyond anything ever could.
Right.
But
And
I
you're
also
trying
find
to,
myself in the Christian story still.
right. And you're trying, and if I can put words in your mouth a little bit, what I'm hearing from you is that you're trying to reconcile the mystery of participating in this sort of metanoetic turn and the care of someone who was ultimately not sharing the primacy of the symbolic language and orientation that you ultimately are carrying.
Yes.
And how could those two things both be true? And where and how can they both be true in such a way that we can understand that they conjoin and refer somehow to something that prevails over both of them? Is that fair?
Yes, but one step further, I don't need them to recognize it. I'm not trying to project onto them that they need to recognize, and like, I don't need John to become a Christian. I don't.
No. I understand.
Yeah,
You don't need them to be anything other than they are. You just want to know how them being what they are is ultimately organized under the same aspect of reality.
Yes, because I engage with John, and I engage in all these other, Christian spaces, and I'm fairly deep down the road of Christian theology, you might say, and I'm not exactly sure how it's possible that someone who is exactly, yes, I don't know how they look to me to be the same thing, and that's why I'm like, I get confused when they're not, because I'm
right.
and how other people are not seeing how they might be, right, and how they might mutually afford each other in terms of the ability to, scale a connectedness to reality, for humanity. And so it's, again, I'm not trying to force that into being. I'm just looking at it and saying, well, maybe if we're in the place of a meaning crisis, maybe we have, a fleet of aircraft carriers, just kind of waiting because they've lost a country. And maybe we somehow have a country that they could serve. And not that we need, I'm not trying to deify John or anything, but this connectedness of, let's say, as I was talking before, the side of the individual in science to walk into the material reality of what it means to be human, and intellectually into the space of philosophy and psychology, and like this multi-aspectuality of everything we can deduce to be true, in our ability to cut the world into smaller and smaller pieces to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. And somehow that actually maps onto our most significant narrative that we built our culture on. And of course, there's all kinds of existential ways we've messed up trying to represent that, because we don't understand what it means to be human yet. Mm-hmm. But if they seem to be the same thing, well, I'm going to try to figure out the ways in which they're not, because maybe there's a tension there that can open up something else. I don't know.
Well, I think, see, to me that this sort of points us to the distinction, a very careful distinction between, to maybe borrow Jung's language a little bit, I think at a time like this is helpful, which is something like the difference between an archetype and an archetypal image, right? One of the things that I think, one of the reasons that people such as you and such as I, one of the reasons why we are so affected by John and why he pulls us in so much is because he gives us a set of tools for realizing our own implicit religiosity. I think that what he does is something like what Jung described himself as doing, which was not to convert anybody to Christianity or any tradition, but in his words, it was to make the Christian a Christian, to make the Hindu a Hindu, to make the Jew more of a Jew, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that we can choose what it is that we are, insofar as I don't think that the symbolic grammar that we're inculcated and enculturated with is something that we can elect. I just don't think so. I think that's the necessity end of the dichotomy of humanness that cannot be avoided.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we are endowed with the language we are endowed with. It's baked into our tissue in some sense. And my own personal version of idiosyncratic version of this, I think, has made me much more attentive to this than other people, which is to say, I come predisposed to respond. I come predisposed with a certain capacity for relating and certain symbolic hooks that carry me into relation. And I can look and admire the beauty of all kinds of traditions and myths without becoming involved in them. It's sort of like to eroticize the metaphor, I can admire the beauty of a person without being physically attracted to them. It's a really important difference, right? And so I think what John might say in response to this is that there may indeed be a great deal that is mysterious about these apparent conflicts and contradictions. But I think what he would say is something like this. I look at this and I can see vividly and lucidly its elegance, its beauty, its mythic astuteness, the particular virtuosity with which it seems to compose and nest these patterns. I mean, that's all very plain to him, obviously, right? And it's through his teaching largely that you and I, perhaps each in our own ways, have been bequeathed a consciousness of our own symbolic grammar such that we can commune more closely with it. But I think what he would say and has said is something like that. It's like, I admire its beauty, but I cannot be attracted into a committed relationship with it. I can't wed it because I cannot force an attraction that is not a priori. I can't make it so. And whatever it would require now, and John, he's careful about this, right? He doesn't foreclose the possibility that it could be, but the fact is that it just isn't, right? We have to be with what is ultimately. And if someone as discerning and as literate in all of these things as he can behold its beauty without being drawn to erotic attraction in the proper sense of eros, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Enough to wed himself to it and to commit himself to it, that, I think, to him and in general, calls into question the primacy of its form, calls into question its formal primacy. And that goes back to this question of the primacy of narrative. Is the narrative depiction of a pattern necessary, the only necessary feature that constitutes the reality of that pattern? Or is it the archetypal image? Is it a way of accommodating its reality into the discernible consciousness that is confined within language, within certain perceptual limitations, etc.? And I think for him, I think he would say that he accesses Mount Sophia from a different road, and that he sees a different side of the mountain, but we're climbing the same mountain. It's just that the road he uses to climb the mountain lies on the far side of the one that the Christians are climbing. That road wasn't available to him, let's say. And so he had to take another.
Yep.
And I think his dispute, or I think his question, he leaves it as an open question because this is all still evolving, even for him, which is a remarkable thing, despite his towering erudition. This is still evolving for him too, and he has the Socratic humility to know that. That path up the mountain just wasn't open to him.
Yep.
But he's found another, and in finding another, he has led scores of mountaineers to survey the mountain and find their own way up and through and over.
Yes.
So then what is primary here? What is primary? Is it the particular road chosen, or is it the fundamental attitude of the mountaineer to scale and to survey and to find and to leave open the question of which road he must take?
Yep.
And the road he must take somehow is prior to his ability to choose it. And this brings us back to this observation about the existential tradition that you and I were both describing, that somehow it involves making possible what was only necessary, choosing that which we are voiced with, and converting, to take the very beginning of our conversation, even before we started recording, to turn the freedom of action into the freedom of will. The freedom of action might be foreclosed, but the freedom of will is an expression of the relationship you have with yourself. To take what you cannot control and find all of eternity inside of it. Right. And so that's why I think he can be, a Zen Neoplatonist, but also commune very deeply and lovingly with Christianity, because he can see its beauty even though he can't commune with it erotically. So that would be, anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So that was amazing, because that was, man, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you so badly is, and I want to ask you about this after I respond to this, but is your ability to use words is just so amazing. Because that was a very, very thorough and deeper representation than I would have been able to articulate of the reason that I don't go to church.
Mm.
Because there is like, and that was exactly what I meant when I said to John, I had to stop going to church in order to become a Christian in that last conversation.
Which was quite a statement. And I think, yeah, very telling.
Because I think that, like, this is just where I'm at personally. It seems to me like the kind of thing that the traditional Christians, when they're participating in the Eucharist and they're doing all these things that Jonathan talks about, that I take very, very seriously and profoundly. There's a way in which that is a symbolic celebration of the connectedness to being in that road up the mountain. And maybe the penultimate way of participating in that, I don't know. I'm willing to allow for it, but I'm not sure that it is. But maybe it's the way of that route up the mountain to become a part of the mountain itself. Maybe that's it. But if the Christian story is real, if you're like, you need to go deeper. You have to go deeper than where you go if you stop at Orthodox Christianity. That's my argument, is you have to let the bottom drop out of the propositions.
Yeah.
And you have to recognize that if God is really God and Jesus really was who he said he is, then the connectedness to reality that requires of you requires the ability to see past the narrative, right? The narrative becomes one, like this horizontal plane of the narrative becomes one with the vertical plane of the narrative. And they all become like, they become the same thing in such a way that when you interact with Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever, because you're now inside the mountain, you see that, like, of course, people don't need to know the propositions that Jesus was a man. They don't need to hear about Jesus to be in contact with reality. Nobody does. Mm-hmm. Nobody needs to hear about Jesus to be forgiven and go to heaven. That's some kind of nonsense. Like, if the story is real, then the only reason that any of this is real is because Jesus came. That's the claim of the story, and like, if that's true, then I am the way, the truth, and the life means nothing except for the fact that your attention is present in this moment because of that act. And everyone's is for all time. It's there. It's all real. And it doesn't matter if you know the propositions. The narrative drops off. And it doesn't matter if you go to church. Like, if you want to celebrate the thing and you get the thing and you want to celebrate that symbolically and be a part of that, wonderful. And maybe there is some way that we're all supposed to participate in that. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know how that works, but I know that it doesn't involve saying that you're out because you're not doing the thing. It's like, you don't get to kick somebody out of reality. Like, you're not like,
yeah,
like, Christ is the gate, not the church. And so,
yeah,
and you know, yeah, he wanted us to put together communities to celebrate. He wanted us to put together communities to be able to see through the eyes of each other, such that we can come into greater and greater contact with reality because of the transparency of the people who are really orienting themselves toward the good, because humanity 2.0 had come. That was the point. But it wasn't about creating a gatekeeping system based on the ritualistic practices of one of the ways to get there. Because the church has to point beyond itself.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's my answer to Jonathan that I haven't gotten to give is yes, but the whole world doesn't need to become Orthodox for Jesus, for the kingdom of heaven to be realized. So I'm not advocating, like in that statement earlier that I was saying, I'm not advocating for a sense of like, oh, we need to do a missionary thing and get everybody going to church and doing the sacrament.
No, I didn't, nor did I think that's what you meant.
Totally. But yeah. So
yeah, well, that was beautiful, Ken. And I find no disagreement whatsoever in anything you've said. And for what it's worth, I don't think John would either, frankly. I think what you've just articulated in so many words is an expression of the God beyond God. And that
is true. My point is I'm sorry, but as a caveat, my point is we might not have to quibble over the point of, was Jesus actually God or not? No, I'm not.
No. I mean, I actually, I really don't. I find no personal relevance in that question whatsoever.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me, I mean, this is the most mock hubristic thing ever, but it's like, it seems to me obvious. It's obviously yes and obviously no.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Like, what more is there to say?
Yes.
Well, there's more to say, but it's like obviously yes and obviously no. And if we cannot straddle a relationship with being in which the answer is absolutely yes and absolutely no, then we're completely off the mark in the first place.
Because that is the fundamental
wrong, and we're living in the wrong form of intelligibility in the first place, right? But that's the problem. That's the meaning crisis in a nutshell. We are not living in the we don't have reality framed in such a way that can be absolutely yes and absolutely no.
Yeah.
Right? Where Christ can be the way, the truth, and the life, and require an absolute relation of us to him, and not be required at all at the same time. How can those things both be true? How? But they must.
Yeah.
But they must. And I don't pretend to have compassed the full ambit of that paradox at all. But I have come to believe in that paradox in advance of understanding it, because that is the only way we come to believe anything, is proleptically in advance of understanding it, by being seduced into relationship with it, by having a moment's glimpse into something of a higher order of real than what we did before. And that is the Socratic seduction, isn't it? Right.
Nice. Amen.
Amen. Ken, this was a joy.
Yes, thank you very much. I very much
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
Thank you.
So,
Wow.
any final words or thoughts that you might want to add before I stop recording?
No, that was it.